It's hard at times, because you're waiting to be put to death. So that kind of breaks a little part of you every day. Kind of breaks you every day. And sometimes I have to catch myself, for being overwhelmed and stressed out, and like force myself to eat because it does that to you where you just don't want to do nothing.
I'm not scared. I'm at peace. These were among the final words of Steven LaWayne Nelson as he lay strapped to a gurney in Texas's death chamber, just minutes before lethal drugs would course through his veins. But the question that haunted courtrooms for over a decade remained unanswered. Was he a cold-blooded killer or just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time? Welcome to Deadline Files. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means a great deal, and it keeps these important stories alive. The clock on the wall of the Huntsville walls. Unit reads 6:30 p.m. on February 5th, 2025. In less than an hour, Steven LaWayne Nelson will be dead. The 37-year-old sits in the holding cell adjacent to Texas's death chamber, his hands shackled. His fate sealed by 13 years of failed appeals and legal battles that stretched across multiple courts and countless sleepless nights for everyone involved. But this story doesn't begin in a sterile execution chamber. It begins 38 years earlier in a broken home in Ada, Oklahoma, where a little boy named Steven would experience horrors that would shape every decision he'd make for the rest of his life. Picture 1987. Ronald Reagan is president. The Berlin Wall still stands. And in a modest house in Ada, Oklahoma, Steven LaWayne Nelson enters a world that will show him violence before it shows him love. His mother, struggling with her own demons, provides a home where abuse is routine and neglect is a way of life. The dysfunction runs so deep that by age 3, an age when most children are learning to tie their shoes, Steven is setting fire to his mother's bed in a rage that no toddler should possess. By 6 years old, Steven Nelson has already had his first encounters with law enforcement. Property crimes, assault, behaviors so disturbing in someone so young that the system scrambles to intervene. Juvenile detention becomes a revolving door. Programs are tried. Counselors are assigned. Social workers file reports. But nothing stops the trajectory of a child whose foundation was built on violence and abandonment. The teenage years bring more of the same, only worse. Theft becomes second nature. Burglary is just another Tuesday. Auto theft lands him back in juvenile facilities repeatedly. At 18, police find him behind the wheel of a stolen car, and the pattern continues. At 20, he's caught red-handed stealing merchandise from Walmart, his criminal record growing like a cancer that spreads with each passing year. But it's not just property crimes that define Steven Nelson's early adulthood. Violence simmers beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. In 2010, that explosion came in the form of an assault on his live-in girlfriend. The weapon makes it aggravated assault, a felony that could send him to prison for years. But the Texas justice system offers him something that, in hindsight, seems almost prophetic: a second chance. The plea deal is straightforward. Instead of prison, Nelson enters a court-ordered anger management program. It's intensive, designed to help men like him understand and control the rage that drives them to violence. For weeks, Nelson attends sessions, participates in group therapy, and seemingly makes progress. His counselors see glimpses of the man he could become. Someone who understands his triggers, someone who can walk away from conflict instead of escalating it. On February 28, 2011, Steven LaWayne Nelson successfully completes his anger management program. His probation officer files the paperwork. His case manager closes his file. For exactly 3 days, it appears that Steven Nelson might have turned his life around. March 3, 2011, Dawn's bright and clear in Arlington, Texas. Spring is coming to North Texas, and at NorthPointe Baptist Church, the staff is preparing for another day of ministry. The church isn't large. It's the kind of community congregation where everyone knows everyone, where the pastor remembers your children's names, where potluck dinners and prayer circles form the backbone of spiritual life. Pastor Clint Dobson arrives early, as he always does. At 28, he's young for a pastor, but his congregation loves his energy and genuine compassion. He's the kind of minister who visits sick congregants in the hospital, who counsels troubled teenagers, who opens the church doors to anyone seeking shelter or guidance. This Thursday morning, he settles into his office to prepare Sunday's sermon, completely unaware that his life has less than an hour left. Down the hall, 67-year-old Judy Elliott is organizing files and answering phones. She's been the church secretary for years, the kind of woman who keeps track of everyone's birthdays, who coordinates the food drives, who somehow manages to make the church feel like home to everyone who walks through its doors. Her husband serves as the part-time music minister, making their family integral to the heart of NorthPointe Baptist Church. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Steven Nelson walks through the front doors of NorthPointe Baptist Church. He's not there to worship. He's not seeking guidance or spiritual counsel. He's there to steal whatever he can find and get out quickly. But what happens in the next 30 minutes will transform a simple robbery into one of the most brutal crimes in Arlington's recent history. The details of what occurs inside that church become the subject of intense legal scrutiny for over a decade. Nelson's version, the one he'll maintain until his final breath, is that two accomplices entered the church while he remained outside as a lookout. According to his account, these mystery men beat Pastor Dobson and Judy Elliott while Nelson waited by the entrance, unaware of the violence unfolding inside. But the physical evidence tells a different story entirely. Nelson's fingerprints are found throughout the church offices. Pieces of his broken belt are discovered at the crime scene. Most damning of all, droplets of both victims' blood are found on Nelson's sneakers, evidence that places him not outside as a lookout, but inside, close enough to the violence to be splattered by it. The brutality of what happens to Pastor Dobson is almost incomprehensible. He's beaten severely and then suffocated with a plastic bag, dying alone in his office, where just minutes earlier he was preparing to minister to his congregation. The image of a young pastor murdered in his sanctuary will haunt the community for years to come. Judy Elliott's ordeal is equally horrific, but she survives. The beating is so severe that when her husband discovers her, he doesn't immediately recognize her through the injuries. Her face is swollen beyond recognition. Her body bears the marks of a vicious assault. She's rushed to the hospital, where doctors work frantically to save her life, while police begin processing what has become a crime scene of unimaginable brutality. Nelson doesn't just rob the church and run. He takes his time, gathering credit cards, a laptop computer, a cell phone, and other valuables. Most brazenly, he steals Judy Elliott's car and drives away as if he hasn't just participated in one of the most shocking crimes Arlington has ever seen. What Nelson does next reveals either breathtaking arrogance or complete detachment from reality. Instead of fleeing Texas or laying low, he goes on a shopping spree. Surveillance cameras at multiple locations capture him using Elliott's stolen credit cards with casual indifference. He buys items he wants, eats at restaurants, and drives around Arlington in the stolen car as if he's simply having a normal day. For 48 hours, Steven Nelson lives the life of someone who believes he's gotten away with murder. The victim's belongings remain in the car. Pastor Dobson's laptop sits in the back seat. Elliott's personal items are scattered throughout the vehicle. It's as if Nelson is daring fate to catch him, Or perhaps he simply doesn't understand that modern police work makes it nearly impossible to commit such crimes without leaving a trail. On March 5, 2011, that trail leads directly to Steven Nelson. Arlington police officers spot Elliott's stolen car during a routine patrol. When they pull Nelson over, they find what amounts to a mobile crime scene. Physical evidence linking him to the church. Stolen property from both victims. Blood evidence on his clothing and shoes. The case against him builds itself from the moment officers open the car door. When confronted with this overwhelming evidence, Nelson makes a choice that will define his legal strategy for the next 14 years. He points the finger at two other men. According to Nelson, these accomplices, men he can name and describe, are the real perpetrators. He admits to being present, admits to participating in the robbery, but insists he never harmed anyone. Investigators immediately begin checking Nelson's story. They locate the two men he's named and quickly discover that both have solid alibis for March 3rd. One is at work with time cards and witnesses to prove it. The other is at home with family members who can account for his whereabouts. The alibis are unshakable, and Nelson's story begins to crumble under scrutiny. As the investigation continues, a disturbing picture emerges of Steven Nelson's life in the weeks leading up to the murder. He's broke, desperate, and still struggling with the anger management issues that landed him in court-order counseling. The successful completion of his anger management program just 3 days earlier now seems almost mocking. How can someone go from being deemed rehabilitated to committing murder in less than 72 hours? Nelson's arrest makes headlines across North Texas. The image of a young pastor murdered in his own church captures public attention in a way that ordinary crimes don't. Religious leaders condemn the violence. Community members hold vigils. The congregation of NorthPointe Baptist Church struggles to understand how their sanctuary became the scene of such brutality. In October 2012, Steven Nelson's capital murder trial began in Tarrant County. The courthouse is packed with media, family members, and curious observers drawn by the shocking nature of the crime. Prosecutor Melody McDonald presents the state's case with methodical precision. Fingerprint evidence, blood spatter analysis, surveillance footage of Nelson using stolen credit cards, witness testimony about his behavior after the crime. The evidence forms an unbreakable chain linking Nelson to every aspect of the robbery and murder. The defense, led by attorneys who inherited a nearly impossible case, faces a strategic dilemma. The physical evidence clearly places Nelson inside the church during the crime. His possession of stolen property and use of victims' credit cards proves his participation in the robbery. Their only hope is to convince jurors that while Nelson may be guilty of robbery, he's not guilty of murder. This is where Texas's law of parties becomes crucial. Under this statute, anyone who participates in a felony during which a death occurs can be held equally responsible for that death, regardless of who actually kills the victim. It's a legal principle designed to prevent criminals from escaping responsibility by claiming they were just accomplices. Defense attorneys argue that even if Nelson participated in the robbery, there's reasonable doubt about whether he committed the actual murder. They point to his consistent claims about accomplices and suggest that the investigation was rushed and incomplete. But they face an uphill battle against overwhelming physical evidence. Against his lawyer's strong advice, Nelson decides to testify in his own defense. It's a risky strategy that often backfires, but Nelson is convinced that if jurors hear his story directly, they'll believe him. He takes the witness stand and admits his presence at the church, admits his participation in the robbery, but steadfastly maintains his innocence regarding the murder. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor McDonald systematically dismantles Nelson's story. How does he explain his fingerprints throughout the crime scene? His broken belt found near the victims? The blood on his shoes? Nelson's answers become increasingly strained as the physical evidence contradicts his version of events. The prosecution's case extends beyond the immediate crime. They present evidence of Nelson's escalating pattern of violence, culminating in the assault on his girlfriend just months earlier. Most shocking of all, they introduced testimony about an alleged jailhouse murder. While awaiting trial, an informant claims that Nelson killed a fellow inmate, though he's never formally charged for this crime. The testimony paints Nelson as someone whose violence knows no bounds, even behind bars. The defense counters with testimony about Nelson's horrific childhood. Psychologists explain how childhood trauma can create adults who struggle with impulse control and decision-making. Social workers describe a system that failed Steven Nelson from his earliest years. Defense attorneys argue that while Nelson's actions are inexcusable, his death sentence should be tempered by understanding of the factors that shaped him. On October 8, 2012, after several days of deliberation, the jury returns with their verdict: guilty of capital murder. The courtroom erupts in a mixture of relief from the victims' families and anguish from Nelson's supporters. But even this verdict leaves questions unanswered. The jury doesn't specify whether they believe Nelson was the actual killer or an accomplice under the law of parties. The sentencing phase begins immediately. In Texas capital cases, the same jury that determines guilt also decides between life in prison and death. Prosecutors argue that Nelson represents a continuing threat to society, pointing to his escalating criminal history and alleged jailhouse violence. The defense pleads for mercy, asking jurors to consider Nelson's traumatic background and the possibility of redemption. On October 16, 2012, the jury rendered their final judgment: death. The decision reflects the brutality of a crime, the suffocation of a pastor in his own church, and the jury's belief that Nelson will continue to pose a danger if allowed to live. But Steven Nelson's story is far from over. The death sentence triggers an automatic appeals process that will stretch across 13 years and multiple court systems. Nelson's appellate attorneys raise numerous issues: ineffective assistance of counsel, racial bias in jury selection, the appropriateness of the law of parties instruction, and questions about whether the two alleged accomplices were adequately investigated. Each appeal offers hope to Nelson's supporters and renewed anguish to the victims' families. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction and death sentence in April 2015. Federal habeas corpus petitions are filed and systematically denied. Years pass. Legal briefs pile up. Court hearings come and go. Through it all, Steven Nelson maintains his partial innocence from death row.
There's many innocent people here on death row or in prison that shouldn't be here.
In 2018, something unexpected happens in Steven Nelson's life. He finds love. Through correspondence, he meets Helene Noah Du Bois, a woman who becomes convinced of his limited culpability in Pastor Dobson's murder. Their relationship deepens through letters, phone calls, and prison visits. Against all odds, they fall in love and eventually marry, while Nelson remains on death row. Helene becomes Steven's strongest advocate, organizing rallies, granting media interviews, and fighting for clemency with the passion of someone who believes in her husband's humanity. She doesn't claim he's completely innocent. She acknowledges his participation in the robbery, but she argues that executing someone who may have been just an accomplice crosses moral lines that society shouldn't cross. Reverend Jeff Hood, a prominent death penalty opponent, becomes Nelson's spiritual advisor. Hood's approach is nuanced. He acknowledges that what Steven did is evil, while arguing that state-sponsored execution is more about society's desire for revenge than true justice. Hood's involvement adds religious complexity to a case that began with the murder of a pastor in his own church. By 2024, Nelson's appeals have been exhausted. The legal system has spoken with finality. Steven LaWayne Nelson will be executed. An execution date is set for February 5, 2025. Anti-death penalty activists make one final push for clemency, but the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles refuses to intervene. As February 5th approaches, the machinery of execution begins its final preparations. Nelson's wife organizes vigils outside the prison. Supporters hold signs questioning the morality of executing someone whose exact role in the murder remains disputed. But inside the Walls unit in Huntsville, the process moves forward with clinical precision. Texas eliminated special last meal requests in 2011, so Nelson's final meal is no different from any other inmate's. He spends his last day saying goodbye to his spiritual advisor and preparing for his wife's final visit. The woman who married him behind bars will be allowed to witness his execution, a heartbreaking end to their unlikely love story.
Her being a witness of my execution, it's up to her, but I really don't want her to see that, me getting pumped full of drugs and being overdosed with drugs to kill me, to make my heart stop. I think that would leave a bad impression, that will override the good memories we had over the years. She'll always close her eyes and see that.
At 6 p.m., Nelson is moved to the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. Through a small window, he can see his wife in the witness room, accompanied by her small white service dog for emotional support. Their eyes meet one final time as free people, and Nelson mouths, "I love you," through the glass. The warden enters Nelson's holding cell and asks if he has any final words. This is the moment where many condemned prisoners apologize to victims' families, confess their guilt, or rage against their fate. Steven Nelson does none of these things. Instead, his final statement reflects acceptance and love. "I'm thankful and grateful. It is what it is." To his wife, he adds, "Always live for me and enjoy life." And then, showing no fear, "I'm not scared. I'm at peace." At 6:31 p.m., Nelson is strapped to the gurney, and 4 lines are inserted into his arms. The witnesses, victims' family members, Nelson's wife, media representatives, and prison officials, watch through reinforced glass as the final act of this 13-year legal drama unfolds. "Let's ride, Warden," Nelson says, signaling his readiness to face death. The executioner, hidden behind a one-way mirror, begins the injection of pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate designed to render Nelson unconscious before stopping his heart. Nelson's eyes find his wife through the glass one final time. His lips form a single word: love. Then his body begins to react to the drug. He gasps twice. His body trembles. But death doesn't come quickly. Reverend Hood, watching from the witness room, later describes how it took forever for the authorities to pronounce Nelson dead. For 24 agonizing minutes, his wife watches as the man she loves fights for life. At 6:50 p.m. Central Standard Time on February 5, 2025, Steven LaWayne Nelson is officially pronounced dead. He becomes the first person executed in Texas in 2025, but certainly not the last. The reactions to Nelson's execution reflect the complex emotions his case generated. Pastor Dobson's family releases a carefully worded statement that balances their desire for justice with Christian principles of forgiveness. "We now can confidently say that justice has been served," they write, while also noting that Nelson had never occupied our minds in the years since Clint's murder. Judy Elliott's son Bradley offers words that echo the forgiveness at the heart of Christian teaching. "Mr. Nelson, we forgive you and hope to see you when we are called home from here. It's a remarkable statement from someone whose mother barely survived the attack that killed Pastor Dobson. But not everyone sees Nelson's execution as justice served. Religious activists question how Christian churches can advocate for death when their own teachings emphasize redemption and forgiveness. Death penalty opponents use Nelson's case to highlight the moral complexity of executing someone whose exact degree of culpability remains disputed. Nelson's wife Helene continues to maintain that while her husband was guilty of participating in the robbery, questions remained about his role in the actual murder. Her vigil outside the prison walls on execution night draws supporters who believe the state crossed ethical lines by executing someone who claimed to be just an accomplice. In the end, Steven LaWayne Nelson's case encapsulates every complexity that surrounds capital punishment in America. A horrific crime committed in a sacred space. A defendant with an undeniable history of violence, but persistent claims of limited culpability in the murder itself. Victims' families showing both a desire for justice and remarkable Christian forgiveness. A legal system confident in its verdict despite nagging questions that will never be fully resolved. The little boy who set his mother's bed on fire at age 3 grew into a man whose final word was love, as he died strapped to a gurney in Texas's death chamber. Whether Steven Nelson was a cold-blooded killer or a troubled man who made fatal decisions will never be known with absolute certainty. What remains is the tragedy of lives cut short, families forever changed, and a society still struggling with questions of justice, mercy, and the value of human life. Pastor Clint Dobson's murder robbed the world of a young man dedicated to serving others. Judy Elliott's survival came at the cost of trauma that will last the rest of her life. And Steven Nelson's execution, whether viewed as justice or revenge, closed a chapter on one of Texas's most morally complex capital cases. The clock that marked Nelson's final moments has been reset. The execution chamber stands ready for the next condemned prisoner. And somewhere in the space between justice and mercy, between guilt and innocence, between redemption and retribution, the questions raised by Steven Nelson's case continue to challenge our understanding of punishment, forgiveness, and what it truly means to serve justice.